Good morning, everyone. On behalf of the Center for Policy Research Land Rights Initiative, I am very pleased to welcome all of you to this talk by Professor Sai Balakrishnan on Revaluing Wasteland and Liberalizing India, the New Land Acquisition Act as a Polanyian Double Movement. The Center for Policy Research Land Rights Initiative speaker series has essentially been created to provide an institutional space for diverse stakeholders to bring their viewpoints on land rights issues before a larger audience. This is the 12th talk in the CPR Land Rights Initiative speaker series. And to tell you a little bit about the speaker, Professor Balakrishnan is an assistant professor of urban planning at Harvard University's Graduate School of Design. She has also worked as an urban planner in many countries, including the United States, India, the United Arab Emirates, and in Kenya, where she was a consultant to the UN Habitat in Nairobi. Professor Balakrishnan has also served as a research fellow at the Land Governance Laboratory, a Cambridge-based not-for-profit organization which studies and disseminates tools for inclusive land resource allocation in rapidly urbanizing countries. Her work has been published extensively in various academic journals and edited volumes, and her forthcoming book is titled Shareholder Cities, Agrarian to Urban Land Transformations Along Economic Corridors in Liberalizing India. So a very warm welcome to you, Professor Balakrishnan, to CPR. We're really looking forward to your talk today. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to Professor Balakrishnan.
Thank you, Namita. I'm delighted to have a chance to share some of this work with you. My talk is titled Revaluing Wasteland in Liberalizing India. And I want to start with a clause in the 2013 Land Acquisition Act. As many of you in this room may be familiar with the protracted conflict over land and the debates over the amendment to the 1894 Land Acquisition Act. And the most recent amendment to it, the 2013 Right to Fair Compensation and Transparency in Land Acquisition, Rehabilitation and Resettlement Act, which I'll refer to as LARA in the rest of the talk. So I want to start this talk by looking at a specific clause within LARA, Chapter 3, Section 10, which mandates that, open quote, no irrigated multi-cropped land shall be acquired under this Act. Such land may be acquired subject to the condition that it's being done under exceptional circumstances as a demonstrable last resort. And whenever multi-crop irrigated land is acquired, an equivalent area of cultivable wasteland shall be developed for agricultural purposes, close quote. Now, at first glance, this multi-crop wasteland clause sounds quite reasonable, right? In the interest of food security, this clause will protect scarce, fertile agricultural land from urban expansion. But each of these concepts, scarcity, fertility, needs to be unpacked. And I'd like to do that by raising two questions from the clause. The first is, by mandating that multi-crop land be acquired as a demonstrable last resort, the LARA targets wasteland for urban expansion. Critical scholars have argued that the framing of wasteland as empty, unused, idle overlooks the multiple de facto uses on these lands. Often the poorest residents in a society are dependent on these lands for their subsistence needs. I want to take this argument further by asking, how were these categories of multi-crop and wasteland produced in the first place? Using the case of Western Maharashtra, I argue that these land categories, there's nothing natural about them. And these categories on which the new LARA is now based were created by former agricultural modernization programs, including the Green Revolution. India's new urban expansion then builds on the land markets created by former development programs, including the Green Revolution. And this is an important agrarian-urban connection that I want to emphasize in this talk. During the Green Revolution, through decades of socio-spatial segregation, multi-crop lands were appropriated by regional dominant castes, and this varies from the Maratha Kunbis in Western Maharashtra, the Vokaligas in southern Karnataka, the Kammas in coastal Andhra Pradesh, and so on and so forth. And the wastelands in these villages were relegated to the most marginalized groups, mostly the Dalits and Adivasis. Which then leads me to the second question: what are the distributional implications of this food security clause when most of the wastelands in India are owned and occupied by some of the country's most vulnerable groups? So let me start with the first question on how these land categories were produced in the first place. And to answer this question, I'll use the case of Western Maharashtra. So Western Maharashtra has some of the most fertile agriculturally productive land in the country. The region is rich in sugarcane cultivation. India is the second largest exporter of sugar in the world after Brazil, and more than 40% of India's sugar exports come from Western Maharashtra. Now, as you can see from these maps, if you look at the agrarian land markets in Maharashtra, or what was then called Bombay Presidency at the turn of the 19th century, you'll notice that the western region was classified as an arid zone. The influential Daniel Thorner Atlas, for instance, of the 1930s, categorizes Western Maharashtra, or what Thorner called the Maratha region, as an agro-scarcity zone where no commercially viable agriculture was possible. In contrast, the eastern region of Maharashtra, what we now call Vidarbha, had exceptionally fertile soil. It had assured rainfall, and it was these quote-unquote natural agroclimatic conditions that made it the epicenter of imperial cotton production at the turn of the 19th century. And yet, by the 1970s, Maharashtra's geography of agriculturally productive and unproductive lands had become almost a mirror image of what it was in the late 19th century. The western arid region became the sugar bowl of the country, marked in green on the map, and the eastern region was beleaguered by severe drought, and it's now the site of farmer suicides, right? And this is a dramatic transformation of political ecology when one realizes that an arid scarcity zone has now become the epicenter of production for a water-guzzling crop like sugarcane. What then explains this inversion of agriculturally prosperous and impoverished regions? And the answer lies in the hydraulic state. So this is a map that shows the major irrigation canals built in the 20th century. And you see here this territorial synchrony between the drought-prone region, the major irrigation canals, and the country's richest sugar cooperatives. Now, the reason that the irrigation canals were unevenly routed to the drought-prone regions of Western Maharashtra had to do with electoral politics. Some of the most influential Maratha politicians of the Congress and later the NCP, Y.B. Jawan, Vasantdada Patil, Sharad Pawar, have their home constituencies in Western Maharashtra. From the 1960s to the 1990s, in fact till 1995, when the BJP Shiv Sena became the first non-Congress ruling party at the state government, the Maratha elites controlled the state legislature, and the water portfolio has always been under the control of a Maratha sugar elite. So it was this tightly intertwined Congress-Maratha sugar politics that made the irrigation waters flow unevenly to Western Maharashtra. So if you had to look at the routing of irrigation canals in the state of Maharashtra, it neatly maps onto agrarian social power, right? So you have the irrigation canals which were made to pass through the lands of the Maratha Kunbi caste cluster in Western Maharashtra, and this routing of irrigation canals in turn helped consolidate the Maratha Kunbis as a surplus producing formidable electoral constituency in the country. Now remember, in the 1960s to the 1980s was the Green Revolution period, and this agrarian water politics played itself out in regionally specific ways in different parts of the country. So the Jats in western UP and Punjab, Vokkaligas in southern Karnataka, Kammas, coastal Andhra Pradesh, these dominant castes controlled the state legislature, and they ensured that the Green Revolution subsidies of water, seeds and fertilizers were captured by their caste constituents. So the Green Revolution then relied on a hydraulic state, and it produced a distinct form of agrarian capitalism, where dominant castes gained control over the multi-crop land, and the land that was bypassed by the irrigation canals, the quote-unquote wastelands, were relegated to subordinate caste groups. So uneven land markets and caste class power are related, and they shaped one another. Now, in Western Maharashtra, what did this geography of agrarian capitalism look like? In 2014, I collected land data from 242 villages and census towns, and these villages and census towns are located in 7 talukas in Western Maharashtra: Panvel, Khalapur, Mawal, Mulchi, Khed, Haveli and Baramati. Now, there are 7 categories of agricultural land classified by the 1966 Maharashtra Land Revenue Code. These land categories have their provenance in colonial era land revenue systems, when agricultural land was one of the main sources of public revenues. Though agricultural land tax was abolished in post-colonial India, these land categories continue to be used today, and they become the basis for determining compensation price for acquisition, as well as for setting the ready reckoner rate, or the circle rate as it's called in Delhi. Now, in these maps, I want us to focus on 2 land categories, right? The Bagayat or the multi-crop land, and the Dongar part or the barren and uncultivable wasteland. And what you'll see in these maps is I've outlined the 242 villages and census towns. Not all villages have all categories of land, and what you see in color is the villages with that specific category of land. So let's first look at the geography of multi-crop land. And you'll see here that there are 3 talukas in Western Maharashtra that have multi-crop land: Khed, Haveli and Baramati. The fact that Baramati taluka has multi-crop land should come as no surprise. Baramati is the home constituency of Sharad Pawar, and the Pawar family has held uninterrupted control over the water portfolio for the past 20 years, and they've ensured that generous doses of irrigation waters flow to their constituency. Also notice that Baramati taluka does not have any wasteland, right? And going back to the earlier Thona maps, Baramati, Khed and Haveli are located in the arid agro-scarcity zone. In contrast, take a look at the Mulchi taluka. Now, the Mulchi taluka is located in the Western Ghats. Some of the major rivers in India originate in the Western Ghats. And the Mulchi taluka, for this reason, has one of the highest density of dams in the country. Ironically, despite having major rivers and dams, Mulchi taluka does not have any multi-crop land. It only has wasteland. Right? So you see here this spatial mismatch of the costs and benefits of big dam construction. The Mulchi residents had their lands flooded and rendered waste by the big dams, but the irrigation water from these dams was made to flow by the electorally powerful Marathas to the drought-prone talukas, which then helped transform the Western Maharashtra arid region into a sugarcane exporting zone. So I want to re-emphasize here a key insight from these maps, that the categories of multi-crop and wasteland are not based on some quote-unquote natural attributes like rainfall. Instead, these categories were socially produced by a hydraulic state, by an earlier era of agricultural modernization programs, which unevenly routed irrigation waters to certain regions and bypassed others. Now, moving on to the second question on the distributional implications. What happens now when the new LARA mandates that the state only acquire wasteland for urban expansion? What are the distributional implications of this clause? So let's take a look again at these maps. These are the land prices for the 242 villages in 2016. And there's a very important and unexpected finding here. Right? You'll see here that Shiroli census town, which is located in Khed taluka, the price of wasteland is around 32 lakh rupees. Now, the Khed taluka is the site of a new SEZ, and as per the LARA mandate, only wastelands were acquired for the SEZ. And you notice here that Shiroli taluka, because of the demand for the wasteland for the SEZ, Shiroli, the price of wasteland in Shiroli is higher than the price of the most irrigated multi-crop land in Baramati. Right, and this is a very important finding because in Western Maharashtra then, wasteland owned by Adivasis in Khed taluka can become a more valorized commodity than the multi-crop land owned by the Baramati Marathas, right? And I just want to emphasize this point to say how crucial this revaluation of wasteland is for agrarian social power. So if I just had to recap this argument, in an agrarian society, dominant castes controlled the countryside through control over agriculturally productive land. But now with the urbanization of the countryside, advantageously located wastelands can become a more desirable market asset than disadvantageously located multi-crop land, right? So in short, as location trumps fertility as the main metric of land price, this recalibration of land markets disrupts agrarian land-based power. Now I want to use the case of the Cade SEZ to delve into this redistribution of the recalibration of agrarian land-based power. This is a map of the Cade SEZ. The SEZ boundary is in orange, and phase 1 of the SEZ, as you can see, encompasses 4 villages: Kanesar, Dhabi, Nimgaon and Shirur. The grey area is the Dongarpad land, and the white area is the multi-crop land. Now, more than 40% of the Dongarpad lands are owned by an Adivasi group called the Thakars, right? And you can see that the Cade SEZ only includes the wasteland and not the multi-crop land. Now, the Thakars have historically worked as agricultural laborers on the multi-crop lands of the Marathas. But with the new market demand for their land, they found themselves to be the owners of a high-value market asset. The younger generation Thakars now refuse to work on the lands of the upper caste Marathas. A common refrain heard in Cade Taluka is Mazdoor nahi milte, workers are not found. And a Maratha landowner in Kanesar summed up the problem as follows, open quote, earlier, the villagers used to come for work, Thakars and others. The Thakars used to work from morning to night, now they do not. Earlier we used to pay 60 rupees, now no one comes for less than 100. And they come at 11 and leave at 5, take a break for lunch. This is everywhere. Here in Cade, because of the land money, it is more. Ab mazdoor nahi milte. So the younger generation Thakars are using the revaluation of their wasteland to increase their bargaining power vis-a-vis the Marathas. My first visit to the Kanesar Thakar settlement took place in 2010, and this is an image from the earlier Thakar settlement. At sundown, the scattered cluster of one-room houses made of rammed mud walls and thatched roofs was plunged in darkness. The Thakar settlements were on hillocks and had no access to water or electricity. 2 or 3 cows were tethered outside the houses, and a row of steel pots lined the external plinths. With these pots, the women would fetch water from public taps located in the Gauthan in the village center, trekking 45 minutes each way every day to their only water source. Now, with the building of the new SEZ, the Kanesar Thakars were relocated to a new settlement colony, as you can see in this image. The acquisition of only wasteland for the Cade SEZ meant that the Thakars' lands were in high demand. And the Thakars then used their locational advantage to negotiate with the Maratha local elites and the SEZ bureaucrats. They demanded that their new resettlement colony is located closer to the Kanesar Gauthan so that women and children have to walk less to reach basic public amenities like water wells and government schools. Right? And this is a key point, that the Thakars were willing and eager to give up their land for the new SEZ, not for the profits to be made from land redevelopment, but for the increased bargaining power that comes with the revaluation of their land. Right? The Thakars should have had access to a public service like water, which they didn't because of caste discrimination, and they're now leveraging their status as landowners to change the geography of water access, which was previously skewed towards the fields of the upper caste Marathas. But it's also important to emphasize that not all the Cade Thakars are eager about the revaluation of their wasteland. Now, in Kanesar, the younger generation male Thakars control titles to their land. Within their joint families, the older generation Thakars, mainly in their 60s and 70s, used their wastelands for grazing their cattle. And for this older generation, dairy farming was an important source of supplemental income, and it was also a source of dignity, right? The dignity that they derived from their work within these joint family systems. Now, with the enclosure and commodification of these wastelands, the older generation Thakars are forced to sell their cows, and they're forced to give up the only source of livelihood that they're familiar with. Right? So what we see is even within the same household, the experiences of the revaluation of wasteland are uneven. Now, the other very important point to highlight is not all younger generation Adivasis benefit from the revaluation of their wasteland. The Khed Thakars have private property rights to their land, right? And their property status is a crucial precondition for increasing their negotiating power. Now, not all Adivasis who are relegated to wasteland have titles to their land. So, for instance, if you look at the neighboring taluka of Mulshi, the Katkari Thakars are forest dependents and they have occupancy claims, not ownership rights to their land. So, the revaluation of wasteland in Mulshi then, for the setting up, for instance, of the Lavasa Lake City project, has led to Adivasi displacement, not empowerment. So, in short, then there are two insights from Western Maharashtra. The first is that the category of wasteland, which is now the basis for land acquisition, was actively produced by development policies, including the Green Revolution. So if land categories can be created, they can also be recreated. If, for instance, instead of routing world-class SEZ infrastructure through the wastelands of Khed, irrigation canals had been routed through these lands, they would have completely changed the land-based power in this region. And this is the point that the new LARA misses, right? That land is the basis for social power. So when the 2013 LARA states that any acquisition of multi-crop land be replaced by an equivalent area of wasteland for agricultural development, it's a very mechanistic view of land markets that completely misreads the source of India's land conflicts. And the second insight is that ex ante, we cannot determine the distributional outcomes of the food security clause. A blanket clause that says that a certain category of land be acquired for urban expansion is futile, right? Because under certain conditions, certain marginalized groups may be empowered by the revaluation of wastelands and others may be denied access to their land, right? So this question then of who benefits and who loses from the revaluation of wasteland depends on that specific agrarian property regime, which in itself was produced by earlier agricultural modernization policies. What then is a just and equitable way forward? And I want to end now with Karl Polanyi. In his 1944 book, The Great Transformation, Polanyi argued that land is a fictitious commodity. And what he meant by this was that land is not an object that was originally produced for sale on the market. Land can never be reduced to a mere commodity because, as the negative consequences of an unrestrained, commoditized land market become apparent, people resist, open quote, they refuse to act like lemmings marching over a cliff to their own destruction, close quote. And this is what Polanyi called the double movement, right? Any effort to commodify land will be resisted and met by counter movements to either slow down the rate of market change or to protect certain lands from the incursions of the market. So the ongoing debates in India on the commons, for instance, on protecting lands in the commons, is about the decommodification of land in a liberalizing economy. In his work, the recent book, The Price of Land, Sanjay Chakravarti argues that the crux of India's land conflicts is overprice. But he also adds a very important caveat, and he says certain lands have price, but others, like Khajuraho, are priceless. Right? But the important question is, who decides which lands have price and which are priceless? Who decides which lands, which categories and geographies of land have to be opened to market relations and which have to be protected from the incursions of the market. Timothy Mitchell argued that the line separating market from non-market relations is not a clear-cut line. It is, open quote, a scene of political battles in which new moral claims, arguments about justice, and forms of entitlement are forged, close quote. India's land conflicts are not about either the commodification or the decommodification of agricultural land. Instead, the crux of India's land conflict lies in the complex negotiations over which lands to commodify and which to decommodify, and most importantly, who decides, right? Who is at the negotiating table when these land use decisions are being made. And this is where Polanyi comes in. For Polanyi, what is crucial is that there are open democratic forums within which these struggles can take place. In certain agrarian contexts in India, it might benefit the most marginalized groups to have their lands commodified. In other contexts, it may be imperative that their lands are protected from the market and are decommodified. But what's important is that these decisions on land commodification and decommodification take place through a process in which the poorest, non-propertied citizens have a voice. Now, in the ongoing debates on LARA, there is a clause, the Social Impact Assessment Clause. And the clause mandates that the Gram Sabha, which is a democratic deliberative institution set up by the 73rd and 74th constitutional amendments, should be an integral part of the land use decision-making process. Clauses like the Social Impact Assessment, the SIA, are the Polanyian counter-movement. And it's imperative that in the ongoing debates over LARA, the SIA is not diluted, right? It's only through such clauses like the SIA and the consent clause that land commodification and decommodification can be firmly entrenched in the public sphere where they belong. Thank you.